Dr. Neema Parvini, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, John.
Perhaps we can begin with unpacking, at least from a historical perspective, the different views of history. I know you have in your book, Prophets of Doom, said that typically there has been a linear view of history, but there are also cyclical views of history. And perhaps we can begin with what each of these are and what a salient example to bring each of those to life would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, cyclical history is really the idea that civilizations rise and fall and go through something like the seasonal cycles. You know, if you want to use Spengler's model, which is probably the one most people will be at least, you know, even if they haven't read Spengler, they'll have through osmosis come across it at some point in their life, where you get, where bursting forth, you get a civilization in spring, then there's a summer, a high noon, an autumnal phase, and then the winter. And then at some point there'll be a collapse, and the whole cycle starts again. Much like every year we go through the seasonal cycles. So that's one way of looking at history, which we can talk about in a moment. But then there's the linear view of history, which also comes in different forms. Most people are probably most familiar with the Whiggish or progressive view of history, where we are going forward in a straight line, marching onwards and upwards, getting more sophisticated all the time, becoming socially, morally superior from our primitive past. That has been the dominant way of viewing history for most of our lives, where, the past is seen as in some way being barbaric and backwards, and we're getting more and more civilized all the time. Okay. So that is a kind of progressive linear history. But as I talk about in the book, there is an older linear history that comes out of Abrahamic religion. All of the Abrahamic religions have some form of linear history where, very simply, the world starts, God creates the world, and then certain things have to happen in a certain order, right? So in the story of the Bible, for example, there's a prophecy foretold, Messiah will come, he does come, and then after his coming, various other things have to happen before the second coming and Armageddon, and then the world will end. Okay, so that is a linear history. And the progressive linear history, as I talk about in the book, is kind of a bastardization or a rearticulation or a perversion, I might say, of that older story that was told, that was certainly for a period in the medieval era actually declinist in nature, where you get various 12th and 13th century monks talking about how there's the city of God and the city of man, and the city of man basically just gets worse and worse and worse until the city of God comes, right? And then it's kind of beyond anything I think most of your listeners will be interested in. But once you get various Protestant sects, you then get how can I put it, more esoteric forms of this, I guess, where there's this 1,000 years between the reign of God on earth before the Armageddon, and again, depending on who you ask, we're there, we're not there, it's coming. The second coming means that God is literally here, versus, it actually means that man is ruling in God's name and all this sort of thing. But all of these kind of interdenominational theological arguments, once you get through all of those arguments that took place, weirdly, something like the liberal progressive version of history comes out the other end of it. And yeah, I mean, I'm never on my most comfortable ground discussing theology because, frankly, I don't really I don't really care about it as a topic. But you can see how the declinist a declinist linear version of history can be inverted if you actually think that we're preparing for this kind of great time of the Messiah, etc. So yeah, and I mean these narratives actually have, in lots of strange ways, come back into mainstream politics due to the conflict in the Middle East, where if you actually listen to some of the evangelicals in America talk, or even some of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu have said, I mean, we're back in the realm of, biblical prophecy, or, you know, there's various Judaic versions of that, third temples and so on. So these are, from a completely neutral stance, live forces in the world today that are still at large. I tend towards the view that empires rise and fall, and that if anybody doesn't think that, my question is always, well, so you think the American empire, which is the one that we're living under now, that's just going to exist indefinitely for the next 1,000 years, 2,000 years? I mean, at some point it will fall, right? So, and something else will come and take its place, just as the Roman Empire fell and the Ottoman Empire fell and the various Persian empires have fallen and the British Empire fell. So too will this happen to the American empire sooner or later.
Well, let's zoom in on Britain a little bit here, because you mentioned the fall of the British Empire. I think lots of people could probably subscribe to the notion of the cyclical view of history, that ultimately we're currently in that tail end of the fallout from having become a civilization that was very confident in itself. It had conviction that the things that it produced, whether you're looking at various parts of the English-Scottish contributions to the canon and scientific endeavour, and then when we look at everything that's happened post-decolonisation, post-Second World War, and where Britain is at now, I think people could say, yes, it feels like a country that could potentially be out of ideas. It's running on fumes. And I know you've written that countries, civilizations, they're only young once, as you just talked through that seasonal cycle. Do you think that the liberal progressive view of history, which I remember growing up with, I mean, I'd say up until the point, and I don't know whether it was an age thing or a maturity thing, but I certainly do remember thinking very, very starkly that we had clearly moved on from the past, that we were clearly so much better, and that we were going to continue getting so much better. And then I think I ended up with a bit of a view like Ed West has, which is he's a techno-optimist but a cultural pessimist. Do you think that we are getting to a point where people do feel as though that progressive worldview history is falling away, that people perhaps accept or recognize that we are in the winter of a civilization? And I suppose, probably more importantly, do you believe that we are?
Well, I mean, one of the things that interests me is that when you show people images of the 1950s of this country, or indeed in America, where you've got clean streets, or you've got these old communities with village greens, and they look impossibly idealized, to the point where you even have some leftists who deny it or claim it's constructed or in some way. Okay. But I mean, this is just video footage that was taken of the 1950s. Okay. I mean, and then you go to your typical high street today with its endless vape shops and, people are from various different backgrounds milling about on the corner. and everybody looking at their mobile phone. And does it feel like that's progress? I mean, does anybody really believe that things are better off now than they were back then? So it was kind of, I think it was easier to sell this progressive vision of history if people felt that things were getting better, okay? Or if people felt that their lives were better than their parents' lives. But of course, anybody, I think, from millennials on down, millennials and the Zoomers, possibly even some of the younger Gen Xers as well. Well, that's just not been true. I was born in the early 80s, and I felt that I've lived my entire life under the shadow of the boomers, of their cultural achievements, of their kind of cultural ground zero in the 1960s. And, I was a teenager in the 90s, and the 90s was already a kind of homage to the 60s. Do you remember the Blur and Oasis and, but it was all nostalgia. It was all looking back. It was all like, oh, the Beatles again. Or if you look at the Blur, it was the Kinks again. But if you go back to the Beatles and the Kinks, even they were already nostalgic. Okay. Already trying to yes, there was the 60s cultural revolution, but there's also a sense of loss. Anybody listens to Sergeant Pepper or Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society, there's a sense of they knew that they were living through something that was being lost. Okay, now in the 60s, there was cause to be optimistic about that. And possibly the last dying fumes of that were in the 1990s when we grew up. Now in 2025, what Blair was selling, and when I was 18, of this kind of optimistic vision of technology getting better and life getting better for everybody, is a much more difficult sell, I think, when people can't get on the housing ladder, when people can't get jobs, it's not that they can't get jobs, it's that they can't get the kind of professional class jobs that they feel that they're entitled to. And one of the bad legacies of Blair is what they call elite overproduction. That is the dragooning of millions of people into university who frankly shouldn't really be in university. And then they've done degrees that don't really lead naturally to a job. And then those ones who do jobs, they do their degree in, they could be English literature or history, or, they could be studying the classics or something. But what they actually end up doing is working for some massive multinational corporation, on a middling salary, doing marketing or internal communications or something, which, it's kind of, it's like, well, okay, this is the progress. This is what this is the promised land. And obviously, it's not just men, of course, but millions of women too have been sold this dream. And it's like, okay, it's framed as liberation. It's framed as progress. But, a very simple question to ask would be, well, there's something called the female happiness paradox. There's vast literature on this. As emancipation of women into the workplace has progressed, their happiness, as registered in various surveys and empirical studies, has progressively declined. Their mental health has progressively got worse. Anxiety is through the roof. Suicide rates have increased. Women are denied starting a family when they're young, and now are forced to start families in their late 30s or even early 40s. And at some point, they sit down and they think, I was sold this liberal dream. I spent most of my formative years chained to a desk, writing emails for Microsoft. Was it all that? Was it better than the life that my grandparents had? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that it's even being questioned shows that it's not obvious. Whereas I feel like in the 90s, when we were teenagers, maybe, it felt more obvious that it was kind of going onwards and upwards to most people. Now I think people are more pessimistic about that whole vision. And another problem is that our elites, the elite class, are so, it's almost like a sunk cost. They're so far in on this that they have no answers whatsoever to any of these questions at all, except for more of it. You know, Keir Starmer ran on a platform of growth, growth, growth. I saw Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, wrote an article the other day saying, oh, look, there's cause for celebration because Britain has added 5 million people to the population. I mean, okay, that may make sense if GDP is your only concern. Not that those 5 million people have necessarily led to economic growth, by the way. I saw another study showing that they've cost the country 35 billion people, 35 billion pounds, but that's another story. The point is that, okay, right now we're going to have a population of 70 million people, 75 million people, 80 million people. Again, that might be good for Microsoft, but is it better for the standard of living? Is it better for your happiness, for your life, for the country you want to lead? And I mean, I'm much more, you mentioned tech optimism or Anglo-futurism or something. I'm much more of the mind of like, well, wouldn't it actually be better if you just halve the population? Wouldn't be good for growth. It wouldn't be good for Microsoft, but it might be good for the prospect of you buying a house or living a fulfilling life or being part of a community. But these questions are put out of doors by our elites who just aren't concerned about that because their bottom line everywhere and always is economic. So.
Agreed. It's that population question is an interesting one. I am grappling with this myself, and recently, as I was questioning whether economic growth or countries' economic security, stability, vibrancy comes from an ever-growing population, I had found myself reading works of anthropology by Professor Alan Macfarlane, who's Professor Emeritus at Cambridge, and he's done lots of work on the English. I mean, he's lived all over. He's lived in Nepal and Japan and China. And he realised as he left the British Isles that there was something very unique about the place he'd come from, and that led him down the path of doing lots of research as to what made the people of this country culturally different. And you can find quite a lot of examples in that where he is talking about how apart from that very fecund period of the Industrial Revolution where there were lots of children being born, is that typically compared to most other countries, those with peasant societies, the English in particular, and then the Celtic fringe, never actually went for the big family, and most populations were kept in check. It grew very, very modestly. And you mentioned earlier on the video footage of times gone by, which show just how pristine and safe, I suppose, this society was in this country not that long ago. And I think what's quite interesting is we can also look at the most productive periods culturally, economically in this country's history, and it was not with a massive population. It shows that you can actually get more from less in some ways without getting too economic about it, because I think it is ridiculous how our media elites always go with that line as though they're chasing the GDP, as though that's the only thing that matters, and as though you can't see things with your own eyes, that things clearly aren't working that well. And I said this to Connor Tomlinson and Harrison Pitt the other day. I went on the programme, and I know you've been on that show, and I said, because I grew up in a small market town in Northumberland, I, like you had experienced, you felt like things were still just about right. They were on the onwards and upwards. And that was a very secure town. I could run around outside. It was a place that I didn't have to worry about big predators, as it were. And I suppose as I left school early, didn't go to university, I didn't get that whole shaping of the liberal progressive worldview, but I picked up on it from the media, from the people, my peers, when they went off there. And I realised when I went off to cities, oh, this is just what cities are like. They're just a bit chaotic. There is just the prospect of violence and drugs and gangs and all of those things. And then it started to dawn on me that it wasn't always like that in cities either. Yes, there have been periods, and of course there has always been the problems of crime and social issues, but it's off the scale now in comparison to before. And it's almost like no matter what you do, you can't get anyone who is of the view that things really are just progressing if everyone else would just get on board. There's no evidence, there's no data you can put in front of anyone to show that things aren't as good as they think they are. And I don't know when that myopia ever changes. And in fact, you wrote, and this is probably a good point to get to some of the things you've written in The Populist Delusion. You wrote, I think, in page 1, that all social change at all times and in all places have been top down and driven by elites rather than the people. And those movements which have the appearance of being organic and bottom-up protests, for example, the 1960 civil rights movement in the USA or Russian Revolution of 1917, were in fact tightly organized and funded by elites. And so I guess what I've got to ask you here, Neema, is I've heard Vivek Ramaswamy say the guys with the gold make the rules. That was in his Woke Inc. book. We now have seen a big vibe shift, a counter-elite come into power in the US with Trump, Musk, Vance, RFK. If ideology follows power, if we've got the unipolar world coming back for at least a fleeting moment where they're saying, you guys have really screwed things up and things are bad, this is the way you fix it. Do you think that the problems we've just been highlighting here, where people just don't see the problems and aren't willing to do anything about them because they don't want to see them, do you think that changes? Are we downstream of that, or is it not as simple as that?
No, I mean, I'm a little bit less optimistic about quote unquote vibe shift than a lot of people are, because if you just take a step back and have a look at, well, what are the forces at play here? What are the interests of power? I have maintained that the woke, whatever woke was a failed ideology, right? It fundamentally is bad from the point of view of being a political technology that works in the interests of power, right? Why is it bad? I mean, a ruling ideology should bring people together. It should get people to buy into the systems. It should, and woke didn't. It divided people, turned people against the system. It, made enemies of people who should have been part of the system. Managerial class or intellectuals who were fired for petty political reasons, for example. Who then are motivated to work against quote unquote woke. So it was clear that this was a problem that the system needed to correct. So it's not that surprising to me that you've got people like Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and various other the so-called tech bros who, let's not forget, they were there in the 90s, they were there in the 2000s. The DEI stuff and the woke stuff was actually becoming an operational problem. It was also becoming a problem for military recruitment, which, I mean, of course, you can't have an imperium, you can't have an empire where the army is being hollowed out and weakened by a pernicious and toxic ideology. So at least 2 years ago, I wrote an article called Putting the Woke Away, where I said, look, one way or the other, the system is going to pull back on this stuff, because the bottom line is military recruitment is half of where it should be. And you can't have a system where almost a third of the population are checked out. Okay. Now, if you look at from the point of view of power, by power, I just mean the American system as a whole, if you go back 3 years and think about how many people had doubts about the 2020 election, about democracy as a whole, about any of their institutions, about Hollywood, about you name it, they had checked out. They were against it. They didn't like it. All it's really taken is Trump winning, or being allowed to win. Some might want to put it that way, and a couple of weeks of executive orders, and now we're so back. Now everybody's back in. Now everybody's looking forward to the movies coming out again, and America's back, baby, and all this. And it's as simple as, I mean, you don't really need a deep understanding of elite theory to see that actually the system is kind of self-corrected, and Trump was. I mean, what I said was, if they do this, Trump will probably buy the American system plus 30 to 50 years, something like that. And I genuinely believe Trump comes as the savior to the system, not as the overthrow of the system. Okay. Now, it may look revolutionary because the system has a lot of rot in it. Right. I do believe that various arms of the organism had either become rotten or gone rogue. The Democrat Party in America, I think, had got to levels of corruption that are intolerable for any system. Okay, so one way or the other, it needed to self-correct. But now that it's doing so, I think a lot of people who 3 years ago would have quite happily said that they don't really believe in democracy or whatnot, are probably back on the reservation. So in a sense, while it's, from the point of view of stability and order, it's good that Trump has won. But from the overall point of view of, if you want this structure to fall, Trump has done the opposite. He saved it, at least for the time being. I do think the US empire is in its late phase. In fact, I put out a video very recently that people can go and check out, talking about how tariffs are a sign of an empire on the downward swing. If you look at the British Empire in the 1930s, they also started putting up tariffs. The 1930s were actually the height of the British Empire in terms of total area controlled. But yeah, in the space of 20, 30 years, British Empire was gone. Right? I mean, by the death of Churchill, it was gone in 1965. So it can happen that quickly, but nobody in 1930, say, would have believed you if you'd said, oh, well, in 30 years' time, all of this will be gone. But the fact they've moved from laissez-faire or free trade as a doctrine to tariffs and trade wars is something that happens in the late empire, mainly because free trade is best understood as a control mechanism for power. It's a kind of soft control mechanism, which America has done or had done pretty well from World War II up until now. That structure's falling apart, and if Trump represents anything, it is the end of that period of American kind of real dominance in the world.
Very interesting analysis. That I haven't heard anyone come up with that as a Trump as transition, but it sounds logical based on what you're saying. And turning it back to the United Kingdom, where we live, we've got a Labour government, deeply unpopular. I think they're living up to the meme that people were putting out as the Tories were closing out their 14 years of wasted power here, where they said something like the only difference between the Tories and Labour is Labour ruins things even faster than the Tories do. And I think we're seeing that. I think people can feel it. I know some people don't necessarily want to, and I don't make this a partisan thing. I dislike both parties a lot myself, but people are speculating: is this the end? Then do we see reform hitting the top of the polls? Are we seeing us on the home straight to the vibe shift? We're always a few years behind the Americans, and so. Before I ask the question and see what you think of this, Neema, within your work on the Populist Delusion, you made the point that elite minorities rule and cannot be controlled by the majority, even by democratic means, which you're basically saying, ultimately the elite will do what they want and do things within their own interests. However, you did caveat that, and I can't remember which thinker it was. It might have been Mosca, it might have been someone else, but you said that no ruling class, this is a quote, can survive without an effective political formula, and the ruled mass remain the humus out of which grow leading groups. So my question to you is, do we see, with the likes of Farage and Rupert Lowe and Lee Anderson, and if I'm thinking about new media voices like Matt Goodwin, they are this ruled mass, which the hummus of which we're going to see grow leading groups, or do you think not headed really toward a similar British flavoured version of the American vibe shift?
My tendency would be to say that those people that you just mentioned are already part of the elite, broadly defined already, that they are not actually part of the quote unquote mass in that sense. But the system, our system, or the system, one of the strengths of the system of democracy, if you want, is that it can kind of shift in what it does by putting unpopular things on one party or the other party. Okay. Now, if you think that, oh, well, maybe the system needs to do all sorts of things, like Blair's digital ID, for example, is going to come in whether we like it or not. It's going to come in America. The tech bros will do their version of it over there. How do I know? Larry Ellison, the number one funder of Blair, gave a speech on the day of Trump's inauguration and was sitting there with Elon Musk, and Ellison is the number two owner of Tesla stock as well, right? So, they want this. They want that to happen. Your, tech futurist guys are maybe on board with it as well. It kind of makes sense that you'd build this, everything's much more online now. Everything's much more digital. Well, the governmental architecture has to catch up to that, and digital ID is a good one-stop shop, and you'll be able to sell it to people under things like how to control illegal immigration, for example. Well, you're not going to get far if you haven't got a digital ID, etc. So I reckon people will come around to that idea. Point is, though, a lot of the things this Labour government are doing are very unpopular. Okay, and it's possible that Starmer, he's going to be in there for a couple of years doing all sorts of things, hated. And how do you then get the people back on side? Well, once he's done all that stuff, you can just switch it. It's like I talk about pro wrestling a lot. Okay. Oh, people are getting fed up of the heel, of the villain champion. I remember Triple H, the Reign of Terror, they called it. How do you get the people back? Well, let's bring in a beloved babyface, put the belt on the Rock or whatever. And I'm not saying it's not quite as kind of orchestrated as that. But certainly if you can sell the idea of a vibe, of a quote unquote vibe shift, it's easier for people then to buy back in to the whole project and to the idea of the government and the parliament and so on, because now the rulers are kind of aping what the people want a bit more. This is the nature of populism. I mean, some people may know I campaigned for the Tory party to be destroyed, something called 0 seats. I really, I said it will be good for everybody if Labour gets 650 seats, because it would then show, it would make the system accountable for itself and show everybody, what happens when just, have the single party there. Unfortunately, we didn't quite achieve the 0 seats, so the Tories still got over 100 and odd. And now, of course, we've got reform. I mean, I don't really want to make predictions anymore, but if I had to just looking at the raw electoral mathematics, it doesn't take a genius to look at the current polls and be like, well, hold on a second. If Reform are on 25, 26, 27, Tories are on 20 odd, and Labour are down on 20 odd as well. You just combine the Reform and the Tory vote, and that's 40 odd. So it would just make sense to merge the two parties to the end of the line. Now, nobody's talking about that at the moment because we're not close to an election. But as we get closer to an election in 2029, something like, I don't know, the Reform Tory party, you stick Nigel's face on it rather than Kemi Badenoch's face. And again, like in America, we're so back. Okay. Now, you got to understand this analysis. It's not what I want to see. And I'm not being kind of like necessarily pessimistic. I'm just saying like these are the things that are more likely to happen for the stability of the system. It is better for a system to have moral unity between the elites and the people. Okay. If you don't have that, it threatens the social fabric, and you get, you're then accelerating towards the breakdown of the system. Okay. So ultimately, if that happens, if that quote unquote vibe shift happens in this country, and we get Prime Minister Nigel Farage with Rupert Lowe next to him, and maybe someone like Matt Goodwin, as an advisor or something, the concerns of the people will feel like they're quote unquote being heard. Okay. But of course, as long as it is in the hands of people who are already part of the system, then you can kind of take the rougher edges off of it. You can moderate it. You can moderate what, the quote unquote people want down a little bit to something that may be more acceptable to power. Because at the end of the day, anyone who's ruling this country or anybody who's ruling America is not going to be able to go too far in the direction of intolerance, right? Because the fact is, you've got different populations, different ethnicities. They're here. So again, from a purely pragmatic perspective, you have to manage that. And if you have, I don't know, an explicitly racial doctrine entering the discourse, that's no good from the point of view of power, because that leads to the breakup. That leads to breakup and division, just like woke did. So, and somebody like Nigel Farage, he will make sure that is kind of kept out, right? And it will be more managed. The problem is that, and again, this is where we get back to our cyclical history and back to what has happened in the past. The more liberal, tolerant, universalist doctrines that every empire, through necessity, has to adopt, ultimately are the things that lead to its eventual breakdown. And it's almost never the case that the leader or the people in power are going to willingly take actions that, I don't know, cut the empire in half or, lead to its deliberate breakup or something like that. They're going to do the things that are going to try to keep it going. Okay, but often that means trying to do more of the same thing that's failed already. Okay, so in a roundabout way, yes, you could get your vibe shift. Yes, you could get Prime Minister Farage. But Farage is not, in the long run, Farage is not going to do any of the things that many people would like to see. He's going to do things that are going to try to keep the show on the road, which could be doomed to failure. Or maybe we'll find out he's like a kind of political genius who can, thread the eye of a needle. Remains to be seen. I, as a realist, suspect that some of the problems that have developed in the West are insurmountable through the continuity. Like, if we continue, in a broadly speaking liberal frame, which is, both Trump and Farage are part of, you're not going to get the solutions that people want, ultimately, for good or for ill.
What are the insurmountable problems as you see them?
Well, how can I put this delicately? I mean, the fact is that between World War II and now, the leaders of the West have embarked on a really quite radical political experiment that has never been tried before at any other time, to my knowledge. That experiment is the importation of millions upon millions of people that aren't native to various different lands, whether it's France, Britain, America, and then expecting them in the space of 1 or 2 generations to just get on, because they've got this view that people are interchangeable units, right? People are fungible. So it doesn't really matter if you have, Birmingham populated by indigenous Brits or people who were born elsewhere. Now, that may work as liberal theory. It does not work in reality. Everybody knows that if you change, I mean, it's just common sense. If you change the population of a town to be, populated with people who were born 2,000 miles away, that town, those 2,000 people aren't magically going to turn, into the people who came before them. They're going to turn that town into being more like the place that they're from, right? I mean, that's obvious that happens. And if that happens enough, and that happens in an unchecked way, then the things that brought us here, and again, we go back to cyclical history, every empire falls when it forgets about the things that brought them there. What brought us here? And unfortunately for most empires, the thing that brings them there are things that are, seen to be uncivilized by the once people are quote unquote enlightened, right? This is it's the difference between Homer and Socrates and Plato, or it's the difference between, it's like the belief, the British Empire was not brought about by Adam Smith comparative advantage and utilitarianism. It wasn't. It was brought about, like every empire was brought about, through conquest, through particularist doctrines. But like I said, every empire goes through this. Even the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan. Nobody thinks of Genghis Khan as a liberal, right? But the Mongol Empire, fact is, was tolerant. It exercised free trade network. I even saw an article, you can search this in Google if you want, comparing Genghis Khan or the Mongols to Tony Blair, because many of the actual decisions the Mongols ended up doing when they were in power actually start to look a bit liberal, because every empire has to deal with the problem of managing multi-ethnic populations. Trouble is, you fast forward a couple of 100 years, and that original spirit of Genghis Khan has gone. The spark that led you there has gone. And once it's completely gone, then the empire dissolves. And there's nothing like, and you could argue that this is what happened even with the British Empire. I mean, you compare the mindset of the Victorian explorer, I've just heard that there are man-eating gorillas in Africa. Come on, pack your bags, we're going. Can you imagine anybody? I mean, I remember when they were talking about, are we able to build the Millennium Dome? Oh, it's going to cost a lot of money. I mean, they can't fix Hammersmith Bridge now. There is a living monument. Today, we cannot fix Hammersmith Bridge. But back in that era, they were like, yep, we'll get this up in 6 months, a year, or however long it took. So you can see that spirit, the spark has gone. And once that spark has gone, you can try to recapture it by bringing in fresh blood, right? There's a writer called Brooks Adams, wrote a book called The Law of Civilization and Decay, who says, look, once that spark is gone, you can keep on bringing in foreign populations, fertile young men, who've got spirit, who've got like a bit of go in them. You can try to like import that energy, but it's like a patch. It's on life support, right? So this vision of Fraser Nelson, who is celebrating this, plus 5 million people. Fraser Nelson, like, who are those 5 million people? I don't think it's too politically incorrect, John, to say those 5 million people aren't 5 million Isambard Kingdom Brunels or Dr. Livingstones or whatever. They're 5 million people from the third world, let's face it. And this is another thing that I'm very pessimistic about. There's this, depending on who you follow, you'll see talk of elite human capital. Have you heard that phrase? People like Richard Hanania, they talk about elite human capital. Well, I mean, elite human capital, if you look at the achievements of quote unquote Western civilization, I talked about the Victorians, okay? Were the Victorians drawing on a massive pool of university educated people from around the world? Or was that pool actually very small? Arnold Toynbee talks about a creative minority, okay? That the number of people who really change the world are actually just a handful of geniuses, a handful of people who somehow, like I mentioned Brunel, I mean, you can name your own famous innovators from the past. It has almost never come from, oh, I know, let's bring over 2 million people from the subcontinent, because it just doesn't work like that. You can't engineer it that way, and I don't know any examples of where that's really been tried and tested. So I do think that the entire thinking is wrong-headed, and without getting too metaphysical, this is what some people might call the reign of quantity, right? The idea you just throw enough stuff at it, and through the law of averages, the reign of quantity will win out. Whereas in fact, every empire, every great power has a phase where it is qualitative and produces men and women, if you want, of distinction, of differentiation, of excellence. And then over time, that gives way to a more quantitative, empirical, scientific, if you want, way of thinking. But that drains out the great spirit that gets you there. I mean, that's why I'm less. I have less hope for these methods that people have of rejuvenating what happens. If that makes any sense.
Mm. It does. It does. I suppose it totally ties in with your work that ultimately we are in that period of civilizational decline, and at some point there will be the birth of something new, and we don't know what that is yet. Some of the interesting points you made there about how specifically the British Empire was built and the mindset of the people, whether it was the explorers or the creative minority, but even the people that were your everyday Joes and Janes, as it were, that were called to settle parts of Canada. We will give you a bit of land and away you go. But you need to be able to work hard. You need to be able to be working with your hands all day, out in the elements. This is an unforgiving environment. And so much of what was created of settler areas of whether it was Canada or the US were people who had to seriously put some graft in. And if I think about my generation, our generation, we don't have that in us. And I know you have talked about this, and others like NS Lions have talked about this, the lions and foxes theory, where you have the lions who embody that go-getting, fearless attitude, wanting to explore, willing to do the hard things to keep things going. So know when to act with vengeance in order to get justice, and know when to be tolerant. And then you have the foxes, the bureaucrats who, as you mentioned, it's the empire was not built on people sitting doing Adam Smith comparative theories and then going off and doing it based on that. It was a totally reversed role. And as someone who's found myself surrounded by the bureaucracy, and interestingly, you can find passages from some of the governors and our MPs back in the Victorian era who, with the rise of bureaucracy following the French Revolution, they would talk about it being a very un-British thing. We do not want to go anywhere near that. That is not what Britain does. And I suppose the empire was still absolutely in its prime at that point. There's much more we could go on, but there are two questions I'd like to ask you this side of the paywall, Neema. And I suppose the first one is, actually, as someone who is also in that part of the internet where we have conversations and put them out there, is you always want to make sure that what you put out there is of quality, it's been thoughtful, and you're not just, at least this is the way I see it, and I know you see it, you're not just trying to go along with the whims of the world and just draw people in with clicks by, outrage bait or whatever else it is that you want to call it. But I know you in particular have become quite vocal about slop and what's being referred to as slop on the internet. And you've been talking about how some high-profile media personalities are cringe lords. And I want to be able to avoid, one, becoming a cringe lord, and two, creating anything constituting slop. So perhaps you could unpack what a cringe lord is and what slop is, and how we as content creators, inverted commas, can avoid that.
Well, I mean, it's just whatever the latest thing is. One of the great tragedies of Twitter, in my view, is that everybody's memory is like 2 days long. Right? Things that happened a week ago or 2 weeks ago feel like ancient history very quickly. And people just move on suddenly and forget about what's happened. So there's like a constant amnesia, which gets people people are in just a heightened emotional state all the time, where something like following Trump becomes an emotional roller coaster. There's even a meme about it. Oh, it's over, we're so back. It's over, we're so back, and all this sort of thing. And the truth is, of course, most of this stuff is just happening within your own personal headcanon. It's like a fictional symbolic universe where really less is happening than it appears, or not every single little thing that happens has this kind of world-changing significance. Yet, if you go on, I mean, one of my favorite things to do is to go down my YouTube subscriptions or, my Twitter feed and see how many times people claims like this changes everything. I mean, if I counted the amount of things that have changed everything in the past 10 years, it would be sort of like hundreds, thousands of things. So everybody's looking for the great world-changing moment all the time. And everybody talks about it until the next thing comes along and everybody's talking about that. So one of the things I always want to do is to try to get out of the mental headspace of being part of that, because it is very much like being on a roller coaster. And you can only see the roller coaster once you're off the roller coaster. You have to take off the seatbelt, get off the ride, and you can kind of watch it. And then you can then those people who you may follow at the moment, or you can just see them as passengers on that ride rather than I mean, the reason I say that is because I'm trying to provide value-free analysis. I'm trying to understand what is happening. I'm not doing politics. I'm not working for a political party. I'm not working for Donald Trump or anybody else, or the Tory party or the Labour Party. Many people, in my view, in this space now, this wasn't always the case, but it definitely is now, are actually working for various interests. They may be funded, they may just be part of a kind of ecosystem. So their incentives are to keep you on that roller coaster, and they're going to do what they're going to do. I can't change that. All I can do is point out what is happening, and I mean, why? I mean, I don't have any. If you go on my channel, the only thing I promise is to try to keep you sane in an increasingly insane world, right? That's the only thing I can offer, because we are living through quite extraordinary times, and keeping yourself sane is probably the number one thing you can do. I mean, whether we ever land or not, I don't know. That's here we are.
Well, it's definitely a noble goal, and something we should probably strive for, considering just how much of a tombola it feels like you're in, being turned around if you step into the vortex of Twitter or other media outlets that aren't on the social media feed. And I've had a few people say that to me in the last couple of weeks as they've learned about the podcast. Is they appreciate that it's at least engaging in a calm, thoughtful discussion where people can unpack their ideas instead of constantly being steered toward something which is going to generate a whole bunch of clicks. So, tell me about this, and where it turns into conflict. And it's not that there isn't ever space for that. There can be, but it can't be the whole thing. And I think people like you certainly, and hopefully at some point people like me, we'll see the benefits of that as people perhaps start to tire of the constant cortisol levels going up, and they go, you know what, maybe I just want to go to something a little bit more pedestrian with regards to the pace, but it's going to give me some thoughtful stuff to chew on instead of just jacking up my amygdala or whatever other hormonal systems are at play. Neema, final question this side of the paywall. Ask all of my guests this. What have you changed your mind on during the course of your life, and what was it that made you think differently?
Oh my gosh, pretty much everything. I would say that in the 2000s, I was kind of just, a lot of my political views were just defect. Famously, I voted for Tony Blair, of course, in 2001, I think it was. And I had no reason really to question the general kind of waters that we were swimming in. What really, I mean, obviously I've always read widely, and I've always, had kind of unique view on things in a way. I was quite into Marxist thinker called Louis Althusser, who wrote a lot about ideology, and a lot of my early academic work was actually trying to challenge some of those Marxist critiques of liberalism. And my initial response was actually to want to defend liberalism, which is where I think a lot of people start, because you want to defend what you know, right? Things like individualism, and I was born in Thatcher's Britain, so I was pretty much pro-capitalist. McDonald's and Coca-Cola and all the rest of it. I mean, I grew up watching He-Man. I was like born. I was born. I had Thatcher running through my veins. A true child of Thatcher's, Blair's Britain. So most of my education or self-education has been unlearning almost everything I've learned, and that process never really ends. I think the one thing I would say was the hysterical reaction to Brexit. I voted Remain, and I thought I did it in good conscience and fairly and so on. But when the media and the political class and, friends of mine, and the hysterical reaction to that, and watching people who you may have, I mean, the person who comes to my mind was AC Grayling. I mean, he just lost his mind. I mean, and he wasn't the only one. There were dozens of people who, it was like their brains had been caved in. I was like, what? There's something weird is happening here. And then, of course, Trump came around the corner, and it led me down a path really to be like, well, I really want to understand what is happening here. So that was the kind of political breaking point, which I think came for a lot of people. The other big thing I really changed my mind on, which I will always mention, was a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. Came out in 2012. And another book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. These two books single-handedly, you could say they ruined my life in some ways, because once I read them, I couldn't. It's like seeing a magic trick that you can't ever put back again. and it completely changed how I saw almost everything, because you like to think that reason and evidence and things like this are how what governs us, what makes people tick. Those two books turn that completely on its head. And in fact, it was Jonathan Haidt who, in a way, got me into all of this. I got in touch with him, and if you pick up my book, Shakespeare's Moral Compass, he's on the back of it. And he got me involved with Quillette and the Heterodox Academy, um, and it kind of got me down on the path where I was already kind of thinking differently from a lot of other people. And then Brexit and Trump came along, and I was like, I could recognize that we weren't seeing the rational brain at work. We were seeing cognitive dissonance. We were seeing confirmation bias. We were seeing, the analysis I was seeing in the media did not marry up to what was actually happening. And then, of course, the extraordinary lies that were told about Trump, and so on. I've never been a big Trump guy, to be honest, but I can see when lies are told. I've got a very low tolerance for BS, and I was being asked to lie. I was being asked to BS, and I don't like that. Similarly with the woke stuff, I'm not going to talk about respect your pronouns, or I will, because I'm a nice guy. I'm polite, so I will actually respect pronouns. But the back of my mind, I'm thinking like, this is what's going on here. I have to pretend this man is a woman now, and so it goes down. So a low tolerance for BS, wedded to all those things, probably changed my mind on almost all of my liberal priors. It's been a journey.
Yeah, well, one I can totally empathise with. It sounds very similar. Yours resulted in some really cool meetings with people like Jonathan Haidt, but I remember that book being a big turning point for me. But Brexit, I had almost exactly the same experience. Vote Remain for the same reasons as you put forward. And initially, with that reaction, thought kind of half went along with it, and it just felt really weird. And then I realised that whatever was going on was just totally crazy, and that sent me down a very similar intellectual route to you, and I'll find myself questioning all of this. Anyway, it's been very interesting to be able to speak to someone who's had similar experiences, because yes, you find yourself sitting outside of it as an observer more and more instead of getting wrapped up with it. Not suggesting I'm some kind of sage or guru. I still get sucked into things. Before we jump into subscriber questions, I know you have a wonderful channel on YouTube called Academic Agent. Where else can people find you, Neema, and what are you working on that we might expect to see soon?
Well, I've just had a course come out called Foundations of Shakespeare, which people can do on Academic Agency. Which if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll find it quickly, because I'm always going on about it. So yeah, you can take Foundations of Shakespeare. That's something I've just finished. In theory, I'm working on a book called The Boomer Truth Regime, but just to be perfectly honest, wary about finishing that book in current circumstances with Starmer as the Prime Minister. I mean, Starmer, I find him a little bit scary, because there's an authoritarian streak there that I worry that if pushed the wrong way, things could get bad, really bad for us before they get better. So I am, not going to finish that book while he's in power, certainly. But I do have an extract of that, which is going to be published in the magazine Chronicles, where I have a monthly column now as well. So that's an American conservative publication. So you can read me there as well. I've got a Substack called The Forbidden Text, which you can read. I'm not like somebody who writes every single week, or some people like to have 2 or 3 essays a week. I only ever write an essay when I feel like I've got something really worth saying. But quite a lot of people subscribe to that Substack as well. An essay is more durable often than a video, right? I mean, Twitter is the world of pure slop, right? It's like a hurricane, a raw sewage pipe. So everything that's like pure ephemera. YouTube has got a little bit more durability, but once the video was dropped out of people's front pages or whatnot, it's kind of gone. Substack, I find, has got a little bit more of a kind of, it's because it's written, it's there, it's kind of more durable. And then the ultimate form of it is a book, of course, which is, in this day and age, almost like building a statue or something. So, you can follow me in any of those places.
Well, I'd highly recommend it. It's an entertaining ride, certainly an informative one, and I look forward to Boom and Truth Regime once Labour are out of power. I can see your reticence there. Neema, it's been an absolute pleasure. Now's the time where we will go to subscriber questions for Substack subscribers who are paid. So if anyone wants to be able to hear what Neema has to say, then head over to Thinking Class on Substack, and you can hear his answers to 2 more questions. Neema, it has been an absolute pleasure, and these are the type of conversations I wish I could have every day, and not just around PowerPoint documents, Excel spreadsheets. Maybe one day. Wish you all the best with all of the work you're doing. I hope we get to speak again in future, and thanks so much for coming on the show. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed the conversation.
Cheers, thanks a lot.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.